On a deserted road, a millionaire makes an unthinkable decision to abandon his pregnant dog and her defenseless puppies. He believed that no one would ever discover his cruel act, but an unexpected event puts his life of luxury into a turnaround he could never have predicted. The mansion on the outskirts of Gramado was a monument to success. Its meticulously manicured gardens and imposing architecture contrasted with the cloudy sky of that winter morning in the Serra Gaucha. Richard Almeida observed the landscape through the huge windows of his living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, while Luna's distant barks echoed down the hallway. The businessman closed his eyes for a moment, trying to ignore the sound that had been bothering him for days. The Labrador, who had been Gabrielle's inseparable companion for so many years, was now just another uncomfortable reminder of a past he was trying to forget. Luna's newborn puppies had transformed the routine of the house, filling every room with their little squeaks and the inevitable mess they brought. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. Richard adjusted his Italian tie and checked the notifications on his latest generation cell phone. Another important meeting awaited him, another million-dollar venture to manage. As one of the most influential businessmen in the region's real estate industry, he couldn't afford to waste time on domestic distractions. "Mr. Almeida?" Rose's voice, the housekeeper, interrupted his thoughts. "Luna is restless again. The puppies—" "I told you to keep them in the outside kennel," Richard cut her off, without taking his eyes off the landscape. "I don't want that noise inside the house." "But sir, with this cold—" "Rose," his voice took on an icy tone, "just do your job." The housekeeper hesitated for a moment before withdrawing in silence. Richard knew she disapproved of his attitude, just as she disapproved of so many other changes that had occurred in the mansion in recent years. Rose had been there since before, when Gabrielle still filled those corridors with her contagious laughter and her unconditional love for animals. The businessman walked to his office, his steps echoing on the marble floor. The walls were decorated with diplomas, certificates, and photos of grand ventures that bore his signature. But a picture frame, turned face down on the mahogany desk, held an image he could no longer face. That afternoon, during a particularly tense meeting with investors, Richard couldn't concentrate. The sound of the puppies, even distant, seemed to haunt him. Each bark was like a reminder of broken promises, of a life he had chosen to abandon in the name of success. "We need your decision by tomorrow, Almeida," said one of the investors, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. "The market doesn't wait." Richard nodded mechanically, but his mind was elsewhere. In the drawer of his desk, an old blue collar, a gift Gabrielle had given to Luna, remained stored as an uncomfortable relic. He had found it the week before, during a frustrated attempt to organize old documents. At the end of the day, when the sun was already setting behind the araucaria trees that surrounded the property, Richard found himself alone again in his living room. The silence was interrupted only by the tinkling of ice in his glass and Luna's increasingly insistent barks. It was then that Rose entered again, this time without knocking. Her normally serene face was marked by an expression of concern. "Mr. Almeida, I'm sorry, but I need to speak. Luna is different. She hasn't been eating properly for days, and the puppies—" "Enough!" Richard slammed the glass on the coffee table. "I'll resolve this situation tomorrow." Rose turned pale, recognizing something in her boss's tone of voice that made her shudder. "What do you intend to do, sir?" Richard didn't answer. His eyes fixed on a distant point through the window, where Gramado's lights were beginning to dot the night landscape. His mind had already made a decision, one that would change not only his life, but that of everyone around him. The next morning, even before the sun rose, Richard was already up. He dressed in one of his most expensive suits, as if preparing for another normal workday. But his plans for that morning didn't involve meetings or business. With determined steps, he headed to the outside kennel, where Luna and her puppies were resting. The sun had barely risen when Richard opened the kennel. Luna, recognizing her former owner, wagged her tail timidly, her brown eyes shining with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The puppies, still sleepy, stirred as they noticed the unusual movement at that time. "Come on," Richard said dryly, avoiding meeting the dog's gaze. With mechanical gestures, he led Luna and her puppies to his luxury SUV, parked in the garage. The vehicle's impeccable interior, with its Italian leather seats, would soon be marked by the animal's paws, he thought with irritation. Rose watched everything from the kitchen window, her hands trembling as she held a cup of coffee. Something in her heart told her that this scene would not end well. She had known Richard long enough to know that, since Gabrielle's departure, he had become a different person, as if he had built a fortress around his emotions. "Mr. Almeida," Rose called, gathering courage to leave the kitchen and confront him. "Where are you taking them?" "I'm going to solve this problem once and for all," he replied, without looking at the housekeeper. "I'll be back later." Richard started the car and left, leaving behind a distressed Rose and a disturbing silence in the mansion. As he drove along the winding roads of the Serra Gaucha, his hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force. In the back seat, Luna remained protective over her puppies, as if sensing what was to come. The typical fog of the region was beginning to dissipate when Richard found what he was looking for, a secondary road not very busy that connected Gramado to Canella. He stopped the car on the shoulder and for a moment hesitated. In the rearview mirror he saw Luna's reflection, the same dog that Gabrielle had loved so much, who used to sleep at the foot of their bed and who, for years, had been a silent witness to the couple's happiness. One of the puppies whimpered, breaking the moment of reflection. Richard shook his head, as if trying to push away unwanted thoughts. With quick and decisive movements, he opened the car's back door. Luna looked at him, confused, as he encouraged her to get down with the puppies. "Go," he ordered, his voice betraying a slight hesitation. "Go." Luna remained motionless, her eyes fixed on Richard, as if she didn't understand the order or refused to accept it. One of the puppies, braver, ventured to take a few steps out of the car, stumbling clumsily in the tall grass on the shoulder. It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. A small, shiny object fell from Richard's suit pocket when he leaned over to hurry the animals. The businessman didn't notice, but it was Gabrielle's old ring, the one he thought he had lost years ago and that had inexplicably reappeared in his garden days before. Minutes later, Richard was back at the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. The car's interior, once filled with the sounds of the puppies, was now plunged into deafening silence. His hands trembled slightly as he accelerated back to Gramado. At the mansion, Rose waited anxiously, her heart tight with the animal's absence. When Richard returned alone, she didn't need explanations. Silent tears ran down her face as she watched her boss enter directly into his office, locking himself in there as he used to do in times of crisis. What none of them knew was that, on that same morning, Mrs. Eulalie, a lady known for her love of animals, was taking her morning walk on that secondary road. Her attentive eyes would soon notice the unusual presence of a Labrador and her puppies, as well as a peculiar shiny object in the grass. A wedding ring with an inscription that would change the course of this story. Meanwhile, in the solitude of his office, Richard tried to convince himself that he had made the right decision. He opened a bottle of whiskey, served himself generously, and walked to the window. The privileged view of the mountains, which had always filled him with pride, now seemed strangely empty. The distant sound of a bark made his heart race, but it was just a neighbor's dog, an echo of what he had just abandoned. Mrs. Eulalie was known in Canella for her kindness and for the small farm she had transformed into a refuge for abandoned animals. That morning, as she walked along the road with her basket of herbs, something caught her attention. A golden-haired Labrador was protecting a group of puppies, all huddled near a bush. "Easy, little one," Eulalie whispered, approaching cautiously. The dog raised her ears, alert, but something in the lady's serene manner made her relax. "Ah, you seem lost." It was then that an unusual glint in the grass caught her eye. Bending down with difficulty, Eulalie picked up a gold ring. Under the soft morning light, she managed to read the inscription engraved inside. "To Gabrielle, my eternal love. Richard." "So you have a story to tell, don't you?" Eulalie murmured to Luna, who was now approaching timidly as if recognizing in that lady a genuinely kind soul. With patience and affection, Eulalie managed to gain the animal's trust. Her farm wasn't far from there, and she knew she couldn't leave them in that vulnerable situation. With gentle gestures and sweet words, she guided Luna and the puppies along the path that led to her property. Mrs. Eulalie's farm was modest but welcoming, an old wooden mansion, surrounded by well-tended gardens and several fenced areas where other rescued animals lived in harmony. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and homemade bread hung in the air, coming from the always active kitchen. "Welcome to your new home," she said, accommodating the newcomers in a space hastily prepared on the porch. Luna, exhausted from the ordeal, finally allowed herself to relax, lying down next to the puppies. While caring for the new guests, Eulalie couldn't get the mystery of the ring out of her head. In a small town like Canella, it wouldn't be difficult to find out who Richard was, especially someone with enough resources to give a ring of that value. Her suspicions soon led her to comments about the powerful businessman from Gramado, known both for his fortune and for his isolation after his wife's departure. In the days that followed, Luna and the puppies adapted to the farm's routine. Eulalie noticed that despite the physical exhaustion, there was something deeper afflicting the Labrador, a sadness in her eyes that spoke of abandonment and loss. In Gramado, Richard tried to maintain his usual routine, but something had changed. The silence of the mansion, which he had once so desired, now suffocated him. During meetings, he found himself distracted, his mind wandering to the moment he had left Luna on the road. The nights became longer, filled with memories he had tried to bury. Rose, the housekeeper, observed the changes in her boss with a mixture of concern and disapproval. She noticed how he spent more time in his office, how his hands trembled slightly when serving himself whiskey, how his eyes often got lost in the direction of the old kennel. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Richard discovered that Gabriel's ring had disappeared. He frantically searched everywhere, turning drawers and pockets inside out, until a realization hit him like lightning. He must have lost it that morning, on the road. News of Luna and her puppy's rescue began to circulate in the region. The local newspaper published a small note about Mrs. Eulalie's work with abandoned animals, including a photo of the golden Labrador and her puppies. Although the article didn't mention names or circumstances of the abandonment, it was enough to stir the community. Timothy, a 12-year-old boy who lived near Eulalie's farm, became a frequent visitor. The son of a humble family, he was particularly enchanted by one of Luna's puppies, a small Labrador with unique spots that always ran towards him when he arrived. Meanwhile, in his company office, Richard faced the first of a series of setbacks in business. An important real estate project was beginning to show signs of problems, and important investors were showing concern. But, for the first time in years, his financial worries seemed secondary to the weight on his conscience. One morning, unable to bear the anguish any longer, Richard decided to return to the road where he had left Luna. He convinced himself that it was just to look for the ring, but deep down, something deeper drove him. What he didn't know was that this return to the site of abandonment would trigger a series of events that would change his life forever. The morning was particularly cold when Richard parked his SUV in the same spot where days before he had abandoned Luna and her puppies. Wearing an Italian coat that did little to protect him from the cutting wind of the mountains, he began to examine the shoulder, looking for any shine that might be Gabriel's ring. As he searched through the low vegetation, cheerful voices caught his attention. As he looked up, he saw a gray-haired lady walking down the road, accompanied by a boy. What made his heart race, however, was the sight of Luna, who walked calmly beside them, along with one of her puppies. "Good morning," Mrs. Eulalie greeted, her voice firm but gentle. Her perceptive eyes soon recognized the luxury car and its owner. "Did you lose something, sir?" Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. Luna, seeing him, stopped abruptly, her ears moving in recognition. The puppy, oblivious to the tension of the moment, played with Timothy, who held him by the makeshift leash. Richard began, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. "Maybe this is yours." Eulalie took the ring she had found days before from her apron pocket. The engraved inscription shone under the morning light like a silent accusation. The businessman extended a trembling hand for the ring, but Eulalie didn't hand it over immediately. "You know, Mr. Almeida, sometimes we lose things much more valuable than jewels." Timothy observed the scene with curiosity, instinctively hugging the puppy he loved so much. Richard noticed how the boy wore simple clothes, some already worn from use, but his eyes shone with genuine joy as he played with the animal. How are they?" The question escaped Richard's lips before he could contain it. "They're fine now," Eulalie replied, her voice carrying a mixture of compassion and firmness. "Luna is a dedicated mother, despite everything she's been through. And this little one here," she pointed to the puppy with Timothy, "has found a special friend." Richard observed how Luna kept her distance from him, but her eyes, those same eyes that reminded him so much of Gabriel, showed no anger, just a deep sadness that hit him like a blow to the chest. "Mrs. Eulalie has been teaching me how to take care of him," Timothy said proudly. "When I grow up, I want to be a veterinarian." "A somewhat distant dream for someone who can barely afford school books, isn't it?" commented Eulalie, casting a significant look at Richard. The businessman felt the weight of those words. There he was, a man who had everything money could buy, but who had thrown away something precious that Gabriel valued so much: the ability to care for other living beings. "I could," he hesitated. "Could I help somehow?" Eulalie smiled, a smile that carried years of wisdom. "True help, Mr. Almeida, requires more than money. It requires presence, commitment, change." At that moment, a stronger wind blew down the road, bringing with it the aroma of pine trees and wet earth. Richard closed his eyes for an instant, and when he reopened them, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. In Eulalie's calloused hands, in Timothy's simple clothes, in Luna's hurt look, there was a wealth that his money could never buy. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "To start," Eulalie replied, finally extending the ring in his direction, "how about accompanying us to the farm? There's a lot of work to be done, and extra hands are always welcome." As they walked along the dirt road that led to Eulalie's farm, Richard felt the weight of the ring in his pocket and a strange lightness in his heart. He didn't know yet, but that morning would mark the beginning of a journey of transformation that would affect not only his life, but that of everyone around him. Mrs. Eulalie's farm revealed itself to be a completely different world from the one Richard was used to. The wooden mansion, with its peeling paint and old windows, contrasted dramatically with his imposing mansion. However, there was an aura of peace in that place that he hadn't felt in years. "First, we need to fix that roof," said Eulalie, pointing to an area where the tiles were damaged. "Last week's heavy rain almost flooded the cat room." Richard looked at his $3,000 Italian suit and silk shirt. Timothy, noticing his discomfort, timidly offered, "I have some of my dad's old clothes in the storage shed if you'd like." The businessman hesitated for a moment, but something in the boy's sincere smile made him accept. Minutes later, wearing a worn-out shirt and jeans that had seen better days, Richard Almeida, the real estate tycoon, was holding a hammer for the first time in decades. As they worked on the roof, Luna watched everything from the garden, keeping a watchful eye on her puppies playing nearby. The puppy that Timothy adored so much, now nicknamed Max, was inseparable from the boy, following him everywhere with canine adoration. "You know, Mr. Richard," Timothy began, passing more tiles, "Max has helped me a lot. Ever since my mum got sick, I've been really sad, but he makes me smile every day." Richard stopped what he was doing, surprised by the simplicity and depth of the boy's words. He remembered how Gabriel always said that animals had the power to heal broken hearts. "And your mom, how is she?" he asked, surprising himself with his own interest. "Getting better little by little," Timothy replied, his eyes shining with hope. "But the medicines are expensive and Dad works 2 jobs to be able to pay." Mrs. Eulalie, who was supervising the work, gently intervened. "Each of us carries our own cross, don't we? But it's amazing how there are always 4-legged little angels to lighten our burden." As the morning progressed, Richard felt muscles he didn't even know existed starting to ache. His hands, accustomed only to signing documents and holding crystal glasses, were now calloused and dirty. But strangely, there was a different satisfaction in that physical fatigue. During lunch, served at the old wooden kitchen table, Richard experienced for the first time in years the simplicity of a home-cooked meal. The beans with rice, prepared by Eulalie, had a flavor that no starred restaurant could reproduce. "The secret is in the seasoning of love," explained Eulalie, serving another portion to the businessman, "and in gratitude for having something to eat." It was during this meal that Richard noticed something hanging on the kitchen wall. An old photograph showed a younger Eulalie next to a man with a gentle smile. "My Augustus," she said, noticing Richard's gaze. "He passed away 10 years ago, but he taught me that life goes on and that we can always choose how we want to live it." Eulalie's words hit Richard like a bolt of clarity. How many years had he wasted hiding behind his fortune, using work as a shield against feelings he refused to face. At the end of the day, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, Richard realized he had spent the entire day without looking at his cell phone. Dozens of missed calls and unanswered messages awaited his attention, but for the first time, they didn't seem so urgent. Before leaving, he watched Timothy playing with Max in the garden. The boy had shared his dreams of becoming a veterinarian, but also his concerns about his mother's medical expenses and the impossibility of paying for college in the future. "Mrs. Eulalie," Richard called, his voice carrying a newly formed decision. "May I come back tomorrow?" The lady smiled, her eyes shining with wisdom. "The farm is always open to those who want to learn to see with the heart, Mr. Almeida." As he drove back to his mansion, Richard realized that his hands, though sore, held the steering wheel with a different firmness. Gabrielle's ring, now back in his pocket, seemed lighter, as if a new meaning was beginning to form around that symbol of lost love. At the mansion, Rose couldn't believe her eyes when Richard arrived that night wearing simple, dirty work clothes. Even more surprising was the different glow in his eyes, something she hadn't seen since Gabrielle's time. "Rose," he called, stopping at the kitchen door, "do we still have those old dog food bowls in storage?" The housekeeper had to lean on the sink to keep from staggering in surprise. "Yes, sir. I kept everything, just in case. Tomorrow I want you to take them to Mrs. Eulalie's farm. And also set aside those extra blankets we never use." In the days that followed, an unusual routine was established. Richard started his mornings early in the office, conducted the most urgent meetings, and then drove to the farm, where he exchanged his expensive suits for work clothes. His hands, once immaculate, now carried calluses like medals from a silent battle against his own pride. However, not everything was rosy. On a particularly tense afternoon, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. One of the biggest investors was threatening to withdraw his support from a crucial project. "Mr. Almeida," his secretary's voice sounded distressed over the cell phone, "they're demanding your immediate presence. They say if you don't attend the meeting today, the deal is off." Richard looked at his dirt-covered hands. He was helping Timothy plant a medicinal garden that Eulalie would use to make teas for sick animals. Max, the puppy, slept peacefully in the shade of a nearby tree. "Tell them we have an unavoidable commitment to a social project," he replied, surprising himself. "Reschedule for tomorrow morning." Mrs. Eulalie, who heard everything while watering her plants, smiled discreetly. "Sometimes, Mr. Richard, the greatest fortunes are not in bank accounts." At night, alone in his office at the mansion, Richard faced a pile of documents when he found an old folder. Inside, photos of Gabrielle with Luna as a puppy filled his eyes with long-held tears. In one of the images, his late wife smiled broadly while the little Labrador licked her face. "Are you all right, sir?" Rose asked from the door, bringing a cup of tea. "You know, Rose," he replied without taking his eyes off the photograph, "I think I'm starting to be." At the farm, the changes were also visible. With Richard's discreet financial help, Timothy was able to start a preparatory course for his dream of becoming a veterinarian. The boy studied hard in his spare time, always with Max faithfully by his side. Luna, although still keeping some distance from Richard, no longer showed the same fear. At times he caught her watching him with something that seemed like curiosity in her brown eyes. One day, while fixing a broken fence, Richard overheard a conversation between Timothy and Mrs. Eulalie that made him stop. "Mrs. Eulalie, why do some rich people seem so sad?" "Ah, my child," replied the lady, caressing Max. "Sometimes people build walls so high to protect their riches that they end up becoming prisoners of them." Richard felt the weight of those words. How many walls had he built around himself? How many people had he pushed away? He looked at Gabrielle's ring, which he now always carried with him, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember not the pain of her departure, but the joy she brought to his life. At the end of that week, news shook the small community. Timothy's mother would need urgent surgery, and the cost was far beyond the family's means. The boy, trying to hide his concern, continued caring for the animals with the same affection, but his eyes had lost their usual sparkle. Richard observed everything, feeling a growing restlessness in his chest. A voice, very much like Gabrielle's, seemed to whisper in his ears that sometimes the universe presents us with opportunities for redemption disguised as challenges. That night, in his mansion, he made a decision that would change not only his life, but that of everyone around him. With hands still calloused from work on the farm, He began to draft a document that he should have written long ago. The news about Timothy's mother's situation had spread quickly through the community. At Mrs. Eulalie's farm, the mood was one of veiled concern. The boy tried to keep a smile on his face while caring for the animals, but everyone could sense his anguish. Richard observed the situation with a lump in his throat. The night before, he had stayed up late, finalizing a document that could change many lives. Now, with the paper folded in the pocket of his simple shirt, he waited for the right moment to share his decision. "You look different today," commented Mrs. Eulalie, serving coffee in enamel mugs at the kitchen table. "You seem to be carrying something heavy in your heart." "Mrs. Eulalie," Richard began, his voice softer than usual, "I need your advice." The lady sat across from him, her wise eyes fixed on his. Richard took the document from his pocket and placed it on the table. "It's the deed to one of my most valuable properties in Greenville," he explained. "I'm thinking of selling it. The value would be more than enough to cover Timothy's mother's surgery and, well, to make some improvements here on the farm, too." Eulalie took his calloused hands in hers. "You know, Richard, sometimes life presents us with crossroads that seem difficult, but are actually portals to our own liberation." At that moment, Luna entered the kitchen, cautiously approaching the table. For the first time since the abandonment, she sat close to Richard, her brown eyes meeting his with a mixture of forgiveness and hope. "See?" Eulalie smiled. "Even Luna perceives when a heart truly begins to open." In the garden, Timothy was playing with Max, teaching him new tricks. The puppy, now bigger and stronger, demonstrated surprising intelligence and unwavering loyalty to the boy. "Timothy," Richard called, leaving the kitchen. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" The boy approached, curious. Richard felt his heart tighten as he saw the worry lines on such a young face. "Your mom is going to be fine," he said, putting his hand on the boy's shoulder. "I promise." Timothy's eyes filled with tears. "But how, Mr. Richard? Dad has already tried loans from all the banks. Let's just say some angels have 4 paws," he replied, looking meaningfully at Max, "and they teach us the true value of things." That afternoon, as Richard drove back to his mansion, a call on his cell phone brought him back to the reality of business. His main real estate project was facing serious difficulties, and important investors were showing concern. Upon arriving at his office, he found Rose organizing some old boxes. The housekeeper had separated several objects that had belonged to Gabrielle, including photo albums and unopened letters. "Do you mind if I—" He hesitated, pointing to one of the boxes. "They're your memories, Mr. Richard," Rose replied gently. "Maybe it's time to face them." Sitting in his leather armchair, Richard opened one of Gabrielle's letters. His wife's delicate handwriting filled his eyes with tears as he read words written years ago. "True success, my love, is not measured by what we have, but by what we are capable of giving." A distant bark echoed through the night, making him smile. The decision to sell the property could compromise his business, but for the first time in years, Richard felt he was doing the right thing. The weight in his heart was beginning to transform into a long-forgotten lightness. The next morning, a surprise awaited everyone at Mrs. Eulalie's farm. Fate was about to show that sometimes the greatest miracles happen when we least expect them, and that true wealth manifests itself in the simplest gestures of the heart. The morning started differently at Mrs. Eulalie's farm. An unusual movement caught attention from early on. Trucks and workers arrived bringing construction materials, veterinary equipment, and various supplies. Richard was standing in the center of the property, personally supervising each delivery. "But what is all this?" asked Mrs. Eulalie, mouth agape at the transformation that was beginning to happen on her property. "Let's just say it's time to do the right thing," replied Richard, handing her a folder full of documents. "I didn't just sell one property, Mrs. Eulalie. I sold 3. And with the money, besides ensuring Timothy's mother's treatment, we're going to transform this place into the largest animal rehabilitation and care center in the Green Mountains." The lady's eyes filled with tears as she read the papers. Detailed plans showed a complete project: modern veterinary clinic, spacious kennels, physical therapy area for animals, expanded medicinal garden, and even a small auditorium for classes and lectures. "But Richard," she hesitated, "this must have cost a fortune." "Maybe," he smiled, "but Gabrielle always said that some things are priceless." I discovered she was right. Timothy came running with Max at his heels, marveling at all the movement. His eyes shone as he saw the veterinary equipment being unloaded. "Mr. Richard," he stammered, "is it true what they're saying? That there's going to be a clinic here and that my mum—" "Yes, Timothy," Richard gently interrupted him. "Your mother will be operated on at the best hospital in the capital next week. And as for you—" He paused dramatically. "How about starting your practical learning as an assistant to the veterinarian who will coordinate the clinic?" The boy couldn't hold back tears of joy, impulsively hugging Richard. Max, infected by his young friend's emotion, jumped and barked happily around them. Luna watched everything from afar, but something in her posture had changed. For the first time since the abandonment, she approached Richard of her own will, gently touching her nose to his hand. Rose, who had arrived early to help with the preparations, witnessed the scene with tears in her eyes. "You know, Mr. Richard," she commented, "Mrs. Gabrielle would be very proud now." The day passed amid planning and dreams. Richard, who previously only cared about profits and numbers, now animatedly discussed with architects about the best layout of spaces to ensure the comfort of the animals. At the end of the afternoon, while everyone was resting after an intense day of work, Mrs. Eulalie called Richard for a private conversation in her kitchen. "I have something to show you," she said, removing an old box from a cabinet. Inside, there was a yellowed letter. "I found this among my husband Augustus's things. He worked as a gardener at your mansion many years ago, did you know?" Richard took the letter with trembling hands. It was Gabrielle's handwriting. "Dear Augustus, if anything happens to me, promise you'll take care of Luna. Richard is a good man, but sometimes he gets lost in his own success. I know that one day he will find his way back to his heart, and when that happens, Luna will be the bridge to his redemption." Richard felt the world spin around him. So many coincidences began to make sense. The reappearance of the ring, the encounter with Mrs. Eulalie, everything seemed part of a larger plan. "Augustus never had a chance to fulfill his promise," Eulalie explained softly, "but perhaps the universe has its own ways of fixing things." That night, as the stars began to dot the mountain sky, a new energy hung in the air. The farm, which was already a place of hope, was about to transform into something even greater. And Richard, the man who once built walls around his heart, discovered that sometimes you need to lose everything to find the true meaning of wealth. The transformation of Mrs. Eulalie's farm was progressing rapidly, but not everything was rosy on Richard's path. On a particularly tense morning, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. The news of the sale of his company's 3 most valuable properties had spread, and investors were in panic. "Mr. Almeida," his secretary sounded distressed on the phone, "the board is demanding an extraordinary meeting. They're questioning your leadership ability and threatening legal action." Richard adjusted the collar of his dress shirt. He had changed from his farm work clothes into a more formal outfit to face the approaching storm. Before leaving for the meeting, he stopped to observe the progress of the construction. The veterinary clinic was already beginning to take shape, and Timothy enthusiastically assisted in organizing the new equipment. "Will everything be okay, Mr. Richard?" asked the boy, noticing the concern on his face. "Some battles need to be faced, Timothy," he replied, smiling slightly. "It's the price we pay for our choices." In his company's meeting room, the atmosphere was heavy. Serious faces stared at him around the mahogany table, some with expressions of disapproval, others of outright hostility. "Have you lost your mind, Almeida?" vociferated Ricardo Mendez, his main investor. "Selling 3 premium properties to build an animal shelter? This is an insult to the shareholders." Richard remained calm, remembering Mrs. Eulalie's words about facing storms with serenity. "Gentlemen," he began, "for the first time in years, I'm absolutely certain of what I'm doing." "This is madness," another investor banged on the table. "You're throwing away years of work because of some strays?" It was at this moment that Richard felt something different inside himself. The anger he would normally feel gave way to a compassion that surprised him. "Do you know what the true value of a company is?" he asked, his voice firm but gentle. "It's not just the profit we generate, but the impact we have on people's lives." He opened his briefcase and began to present a new project: the transformation of the Animal Rehabilitation Center into a foundation that would also offer educational programs for underprivileged youth, job opportunities for the local community, and research in veterinary medicine. "We're creating something bigger than ourselves," he continued, "something that Gabrielle—" His voice faltered for a moment, something my wife always dreamed of. The silence that followed was interrupted by an unexpected voice. Clara Santos, one of the oldest shareholders who rarely spoke at meetings, stood up. "I support the project," she declared, surprising everyone. "My daughter does volunteer work with abandoned animals, and I know the impact it has on the community. We need more initiatives like this." The meeting continued for hours, with heated debates and intense negotiations. In the end, although some investors decided to withdraw, others, inspired by Richard's vision, offered their support to the project. When Richard returned to the farm, it was already night. He found Mrs. Eulalie on the porch knitting by the light of an old lantern. "How was the battle?" she asked, without raising her eyes from her work. "Difficult," he replied, sitting down beside her. "I lost some important allies today." "But you gained something more valuable," she smiled, pointing to the garden. There, illuminated by the moon, Luna and her puppies rested peacefully. Max, who had been with Timothy during a practical class with the new veterinarian, ran over when he saw Richard, wagging his tail happily. "You know," Eulalie continued, "Augustus always said that the greatest victories are those we win against our own fears." At that moment, Richard realized that he had gained much more than he had lost. Gabrielle's letter, still kept in his pocket, seemed lighter now, as if its message had finally found its true purpose. Spring arrived in the mountains, bringing with it an explosion of colors and renewal. Mrs. Eulalie's old farm was unrecognizable. The modern veterinary clinic stood out amidst the well-tended gardens, and the animal rehabilitation center was in full operation. The most notable change, however, was not in the buildings but in the people. Timothy, now wearing a white coat with his name embroidered on it, assisted the veterinarians with admirable dedication. His dream of becoming an animal doctor seemed closer than ever, especially after his mother, recovered from surgery, started working in the center's administration. "Mr. Richard," Timothy called excitedly that morning. "You need to see this." Richard, who had just arrived from a meeting at the company, now wearing more casual clothes than his old Italian suits, followed the boy to the physiotherapy area. There, Max was guiding a newly arrived dog, helping it adapt to the recovery exercises. "He has a natural gift," explained the chief veterinarian, Dr. Paul. "Some animals have this special ability to help others in their recovery. Max has become our best four-legged therapist." Luna, who now accompanied Richard on his daily visits to the center, proudly watched her puppy. The relationship between her and Richard had completely transformed. Where there was once distrust, there was now a deep and genuine connection. "You know what impresses me the most?" commented Mrs. Eulalie, approaching with a tray of freshly brewed coffee. "How all of this started with an act of abandonment and ended up turning into something so beautiful." Richard felt the weight of Gabrielle's ring in his pocket. In recent months, he had learned to carry not only the physical object, but also its deeper meaning. Love has the power to transform even the hardest hearts. The afternoon brought an unexpected surprise. A group of businessmen from the region, who had heard about the work being done at the center, arrived for a visit. Among them was Ricardo Mendes, the same investor who had so vehemently opposed the project. "Impressive, Almeida," Ricardo admitted, observing the facilities. "When you sold those plots of land, I thought you had lost your mind. But this," he made a comprehensive gesture, "this is something special." The group toured all the facilities, showing particular interest in the educational program that offered technical courses in veterinary medicine for low-income youth. The story of Timothy, who was already known as the local veterinary prodigy, especially touched the visitors. "How much would you need to expand the project?" Ricardo asked, surprising everyone. Richard exchanged a significant look with Mrs. Eulalie. "Actually," he replied, "we were thinking of opening 2 more centers like this in neighboring towns." The conversation that followed was interrupted by a commotion in the garden. Max had managed to get a paraplegic dog to take its first steps with the help of special equipment. The joy of the moment infected everyone, including the most skeptical businessmen. "That's what I call return on investment," commented Ricardo, visibly moved. "Where do I sign?" While the businessmen discussed details of the expansion project, Richard stepped away a bit, finding a moment of quiet under an old pine tree. Rose, who now divided her time between the mansion and the center, approached silently. "I found some more letters from Mrs. Gabriel," she said, handing him a small bundle of envelopes. "I think you're ready to read them now." Richard carefully took the letters, noticing that one of them was dated just days before Gabrielle's departure. His heart beat faster, knowing that those words would hold revelations that could change his life even more. In the soft light of dusk, Richard sat in his old office at the mansion, Gabrielle's letters carefully arranged on the desk. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the first envelope, immediately recognizing his wife's delicate handwriting. "My beloved Richard, if you are reading this letter, it means you have finally found your way back. I always knew this day would come, even when you started building walls around your heart." Gabrielle's words flowed like a river of memories, revealing truths he had never realized. In each letter, she described how she saw her husband getting more and more lost in his pursuit of material success, but kept hope that one day he would rediscover what really mattered. "I left Luna as the guardian of your heart. She was always more than a companion. She's a living reminder that true love transcends any wealth." Rose found Richard hours later, still in his office, with silent tears running down his face. Beside him, one of the letters was open, revealing a detail that would change everything. "Before I left, I made one last promise. All the money I secretly saved over the years is kept in a specific account. My wish is for it to be used to create a place where abandoned animals can find love and care. Augustus, our gardener, and his wife Eulalie know all the details." "Rose," Richard called, his voice choked, "prepare the car. I need to go to the farm immediately." When he arrived at the rehabilitation center, it was already night. He found Mrs. Eulalie in her usual place on the porch, as if she knew he would come. "So you finally found out," she said softly, indicating the chair beside her. "You knew all along it wasn't a question." "The money Gabrielle left. She entrusted that information to Augustus, who told me everything before he passed," explained Eulalie. "But the money alone wasn't enough. Your heart needed to be ready." Richard looked at the center they had built together. The soft lights illuminated the kennels where dozens of animals slept peacefully. Through the clinic window, he could see Timothy working overtime, studying intently with Max faithfully by his side. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Some truths need to be discovered, not revealed," replied Eulalie, her eyes shining with wisdom. Gabrielle knew that. She planned everything, even the reappearance of the ring. At that moment, Luna approached silently, laying her head on Richard's lap. Her brown eyes, so similar to Gabrielle's, seemed to say that she had always known too. "There's one more thing," continued Eulalie, pulling a yellowed envelope from her apron. "This is the last letter. Gabrielle asked that it only be delivered when you were truly ready." With trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope. Gabrielle's final words, written with so much love and hope, would reveal the last and most important chapter of this story of redemption and transformation. Gabrielle's last letter rested in Richard's hands, its words illuminated by the soft light of the porch. "My eternal love, if this letter has reached you, it means the miracle I always hoped for has finally happened. You have found your way back to your heart. I always knew that behind that successful businessman was a man capable of loving deeply. It was that man I met and loved, and it is that man who now resurfaces, stronger and wiser. The money I left saved was just a seed. The real treasure was always inside you, your ability to transform lives, to rebuild bonds, to love again. Luna was my last gift to you. Through her, you would learn that sometimes we need to lose something precious to value what really matters." Each of her puppies represents a new chance, a new love story to be written. Now, my love, you are ready for your last challenge, to be happy again. Richard looked up from the letter, meeting the attentive gazes of everyone who had silently gathered around him. Timothy, with Max by his side, smiled through tears. Rose held Mrs. Eulalie's hand, both emotional. And Luna, faithful as always, kept her head resting on his knee. "She planned everything," Richard murmured, a smile emerging amid the tears. "No," Mrs. Eulalie gently corrected. "She just believed in love. The rest you did on your own." At that moment, as if by a sign of destiny, the first rays of the rising sun began to gild the horizon of the mountains. The Gabriel Almeida Animal Rehabilitation Center, as it would be officially named that morning, came to life with the first barks of the day. Timothy approached with an envelope in his hands. "Mr. Richard, I received the acceptance letter from the veterinary college, and thanks to the foundation's scholarship," Richard hugged the boy, feeling the pride that only a father could feel. Max, now an adult dog and respected therapist at the center, wagged his tail happily beside his mother, Luna. "You know," said Richard, addressing everyone, Gabrielle was right. True success isn't in the buildings we build, but in the lives we transform. The center had become more than just a shelter. It was a place of healing, not just for the animals, but for all the people who passed through there. The businessman who once doubted the project now stood in line to participate. The story of the man who sold his most valuable plots of land to fulfill his late wife's dream had spread, inspiring others to follow his example. And to think it all started with an abandonment, Rose reflected. "No," Richard corrected, petting Luna. "It all started with love. The rest was just the path I needed to take to rediscover it." As the sun rose on the horizon, illuminating the new day, Richard felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. Gabrielle's ring, which now rested on a chain around his neck, shone with a different light, no longer as a symbol of loss but as a reminder of the transformative power of love. Dear listeners, you have just heard a story of transformation and redemption, where love proved stronger than any material wealth. If this narrative touched your hearts, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Also, share your own stories of overcoming in the comments. After all, as Richard and Gabrielle taught us, every love story deserves to be told, and every heart has the power to transform. We look forward to seeing you in our next story, where once again we will prove that love is the greatest wealth we can have.